Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Brian, and then I'll let Brian take over. I want to thank Brian for joining us today on our CIRI webinar series. Brian Barnes is the Director of Strategic Markets at RS21. He is well known as a practicing advocate for the data-driven decision-making and advanced digital visualization techniques as tools to simplify and address complex human challenges across multiple combinations of anthropogenic and natural environments and the many interconnected system forces which shape them. Brian began his career in complex analytics in Los Angeles at UCLA's world-renowned Now Institute. Currently, he oversees strategy and conceptual development for many of RS21's major exploratory analytics and visualization initiatives in young and burgeoning markets from community health to supply chain resilience. Additionally, Brian remains active in academia as an instructor and representation of visual information for architectural and urban design, as well as a private sector advisor to the Computational Ecology's Masters of Science in Architecture track at the University of New Mexico School of Architecture and Urban Planning. And whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. This is Brian. I'm remote on a conference phone, and if anyone, if for any reason anyone has a hard time hearing me, or if I lose connectivity, please do feel free to reach out in the chat just to make sure that we can keep the continuity going here. So thanks for joining me. It's an honor to be part of this CIRI webinar series. I've seen and been part of, or I've been an audience member of many of the great presentations over the last several months, and very excited to be here talking with you about the things that I'm very, very passionate about in my work, which is visual communication of information to help simplify and address complex problems and challenges. It's something that I kind of have backed into as a career, but I have a ton of enjoyment about it, and so I'm really thankful to be here. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in here. As a preview to this, I've kind of thought about it in three separate kind of categories here. So there's a lot to unpack in terms of what exactly is advanced visualization and what is a complex problem and how do those two sort of work together in the real world. So I'd like to try to set some groundwork about my experience and what I've seen in that environment. It's really hard to talk about visualizations without actually looking at some. So I'd like to show a couple examples of some of the more advanced projects that have come out of my work over the last several years. And then I'd like to have a conversation. I think that one of the great things about an organization like CIRI and the broader network that is attached there is getting great minds around complex ideas and big problems. So with that, as I said, if anybody loses connectivity or if I lose connectivity on my end, please do reach out. So again, I'm Brian Barnes. I'm actually trained as an architect coming out of UCLA in Los Angeles. I operate now at our organization as RS21. I'm director of our Strategic Markets Division, which is a bit of a speculative experimental arm where we're trying to attack new problems that we previously haven't worked on before. Before that, I spent a little over a decade as an architect in training, as a practicing architect, and generally as an urban designer and an architectural designer, that both in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as well as in Los Angeles. The culmination of my work at UCLA was a project that I'll touch on a little bit here with the Now Institute. The Now Institute is a research arm, a combination or a partnership between UCLA School of Architecture and one of the more kind of forward-thinking, world-leading architectural design firms out of Los Angeles called Morphosis. And then I do teach also at the University of New Mexico, specifically around visual communication in architectural design disciplines. So again, coming out of the world of architecture, I have been for about a decade grappling with the complexity of what it means to make buildings, to transform cities, to craft space, to control surface, to integrate multiple systems that are physical, they're temporal, they're social, economic, political, etc. This is a project I worked on in Incheon, Korea. It's a multi-billion-dollar airport, and you can imagine the many, many billions of individual components physically that are present here. We have policy issues we have to work on. We have the impacts of architecture on people. Cities are incredibly complex things, and they're extremely multiplicative in their scale. So we can work on architectural concepts at the scale of furniture, or we can work on them at the scale of cities. That took me to work in Haiti with the Now Institute. We were interested in working across a multitude of different disciplines. The issue there was that in 2010, the big earthquake that happened in Haiti, over 300,000 people died. There was $9.5 billion worth of funding from different sources that hit Haiti, and it was extremely difficult to track as it sort of found its way through a very, very complex mire of political, social, et cetera, events. And so we brought our architectural thinking and our visualization expertise, and we said, how can we look more comprehensively at this? How can we understand some of the underlying systems that have been at play that led to 300,000 people passing away in an earthquake that may have been much less impactful in a different part of the world? So this is a production that we produced, Haiti Now. It's a comprehensive, multi-sectoral approach using visualization to really start to understand the underlying root causes of issues. So we leverage the idea of data analytics and visualization as a way to start to unpack the different relationships among systems and to communicate those to a broad audience across many different cultures, many different languages. Haiti and many places in the world deal with very multiplicative cultures in the same place. And so as an example of some of those kind of systemic linkages that we were able to unearth through this process of data analytics and visualization is this idea that Haiti's got a big food problem, and they've had it for a long time. Something like 97% of the rice that's consumed in Haiti is actually imported. There are many, many factors that influence a condition like this, but one thing we started to unpack through this process was this idea of electricity and power being potentially one of the biggest drivers of this food situation in a systemic way. So the majority of Haitians don't have electricity. 90% of them depend on fuel wood or charcoal for cooking. So this woman's carrying a big pot full of charcoal to heat food, etc. And that the fuel wood and charcoal use account for 75% of total energy consumption in Haiti. And if you look at those numbers, it's leading directly to this illegal and overwhelming deforestation. People are cutting trees because they don't have electricity to heat and cool food and keep their homes running. So the problem with deforestation, obviously, is the massive runoff that occurs and all the soil that is washed away. And now the majority of Haiti is really starting to look like this. 200 years ago, this was one of the most fertile agricultural pieces of land in the entire world, and it was very revered for its coffee and for some of its other products. But they literally are losing their ability to be self-sustaining in terms of food as a result of a lot of these systemic conditions. So for me, a lot of that experience was really, really powerful in terms of turning me on to the idea of these multi-channel, multifactorial, complex problems. And so for me, the reason I'm interested in complex problems is because I believe that solving them is a way to help make our world a better place. I believe that kids playing soccer is far better than kids having to figure out how to play in floods. I believe that yoga on the beach is much more enjoyable than being sick at home with a chronic condition. I believe that food security around the world is much better than empty bellies. And for me, visualization has been a way to start to attack some of these complex problems, bring them down to earth so that we can start to actually engage. So visualization is very important from a cognitive perspective. Jeremy Bruner, who some consider the father of cognitive psychology out of New York, talked a lot about this idea that our brain processes different modes of input in different ways. And so according to his research, we remember 10% of things we hear, 30% of what we read, and 80% of what we see, do, and experience. And so we're constantly trying to work on that right side of the spectrum. So if we talk about complex problems, we can look at a breakdown here of simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic situations. So in New Mexico, our state food is the green and red chili, and it's a decision at almost every meal. It's actually our official state question, red or green. It's a very simple, cut and dry, binary decision. There's no degrees of freedom there. It's highly constrained. A jet engine is something like a jet engine is considered complicated. It's got very clear rules. We can behave on it very clearly in a procedural manner. It's very predictable as long as we stay within the governing constraints. Complex scenarios like birds flocking are quite a bit looser, and I'm sure a lot of people here are working on modeling some of these complex and chaotic different systems. And chaos is, when we get to that place where, we really don't have clear navigating rules of any kind, and we've got to just act on that kind of a quick gut reaction type act. So we look at these as a spectrum of sense making, simple being easy to make sense of, and chaotic being much more difficult. And modeling, this is a great time in the kind of history of the world for modeling, given the computational power that we've got to leverage. And so every day we're seeing amazing models coming out from all over the world. I know CIRI is generating a ton. I'm sure a lot of the folks on this call are working in modeling. And the power is great. And what it's doing, modeling is helping us basically reverse the sense-making spectrum and take what would be a chaotic problem and try to get it into a state of complexity so that we can wrap our head around it a little bit easier. Ultimately, we're trying to get things kind of converted from as far right to as far left along the spectrum. Where visualization is really great is at trying to augment modeling. So where a model may have been able to bring a chaotic situation to a state of complexity, with visualization, we're working to get it from complexity down over to complication. And if we can get there, that's when things really start to become actionable and insightful, the farther left we can get. So visualization really works very well in concert with modeling, and it's kind of difficult to have one without the other in a lot of ways. So a lot of people are familiar with this. All models are wrong, some are useful. The visualization, I believe, has a big role to play in the creation of usefulness within any given model. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit as we go. So to get back to the kind of the core of the abstract here, data is useless, wisdom is priceless. This is a very ubiquitous spectrum here, where we're looking at data on the bottom and wisdom on the top. So the thinking here is that data is pure raw numbers or evidence. It has not yet been translated. It requires some sort of active conversion into a different state in order for it to have truly meaningful and effective application in our world. So information is more useful than data and thereby more valuable. So information is data reframed, data translated. Knowledge is actionable and we can actually put it to work in the world. Wisdom is where we actually can look back and we can understand were those decisions effective when we applied the knowledge at this state. What are the results and how do we use that to sort of move forward in the future? So there's a ton of talk. Everybody, I think, has heard this. Data is the new oil. I personally, not sure exactly if I believe that just yet. I think that raw data in and of itself really is not useful in the same way that oil wasn't all that useful until we started to rely on it for things like kerosene. Before that, it had very little kind of value in the world. And so that's part of what I'm working on is trying to understand and get to, through visualization, how do we convert useless data into very valuable insights. There's a lot of data inundation happening. This is part of where visualization fits into the picture. Some folks are really great at understanding the very deep details of any given model or scientific output. A lot of others are policy-based. They're business analysts. They're making decisions that could be better informed by well-interpreted and well-communicated scientific data. And this data overload happens, I think, all across public and private and big and small organizations, big and small decisions, et cetera. So we're looking at how do we convert kind of traditional tables and ways of gathering and organizing data and information and start to build additional value on that. We're working on how do we reframe the delivery of information so that someone is not required to read this 3-foot stack of paper in order to be able to act on information, great information that's out there in the world. How do we put it in people's hands to be more useful? A lot of folks are turning to the idea of dashboards. Dashboards certainly are a step in the right direction, but I think they leave a lot to be desired. It's very difficult to effectively communicate context within a dashboard. Oftentimes, the complexity of these situations can get inaccurately and sometimes dangerously distilled down and oversimplified. And when we lose the appropriate amount of context, then people can start to be misled and start to make some very poor decisions. So one of my favorite examples of very valuable and very effective visualization, a lot of people are familiar with the story of John Snow and his work for understanding cholera. There was, at the time in 1854 London, there were two sort of competing theories about the genesis and the transmission of cholera. Some thought it was air, some thought it was water. And so, you know, an interesting cartoon here of a potential cholera preventive costume to protect from the bad air. What John Snow did was actually sit down and start mapping out the addresses of folks who were coming down with cholera. And that act of visualizing this pattern that was otherwise invisible and complex and was difficult for people to understand the root cause, the act of simply visualizing and mapping this one for one, there's almost no sort of processing or modeling or data translation that's happening here. It's almost purely a visualization exercise. And he very quickly was able to establish a few areas near the Broad Street pump, a source of water for this immediate area. And you can see a lot of increased cases in this area. And so it's one of the early cases of visualization as actually a powerful way to start to attack problems. But it's not just the act of drawing or mapping or creating visualizations. We also, I think, have a lot of debt to pay to our eyes and their ability to process information, to gather information, and to give us intelligence that's important. You know, we can look back across a long spectrum of history here about the importance of seeing and about the role of the microscope and other optical equipment in terms of understanding all different types of scales throughout the world. So everything from you know, cellular structures that we weren't previously aware of in the 1600s to you know, the Hubble telescope looking out deep across many galaxies. We use our eyes in very powerful ways, and without kind of the ability to see things, it's super important in the way that we make decisions and the way we navigate the world. I'm going to take a break here and let my computer unfreeze. There we go. Everything from not just microscopes and scientific kind of optical aids, but the camera and the act of photography. There's an immense amount of information that we can gather that is, you know, very important. Our eyes play a huge role. What's interesting, one of the things about data and visualization is the way that it can be framed to start to tell stories. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes we need a little bit of context for that, but this is an interesting kind of take on scale and the way that things can be kind of blown out of proportion. So in our work, we attack the idea of, or the creation of kind of advanced visualization products around 5 different kind of principles that we believe help to bring the most value. So the first one being light. Analytics and visualization allow us to see things that we otherwise couldn't see before. It's a great tool to bring to bear information, context, conditions, details, nuance, etc. Visualization can help provide a great deal of context around these complex problems. A lot of folks out in the world tend to work in a very sort of isolated and singular way. So an economist will often come to a big urban problem with a purely economist type viewpoint. And so being able to see the forest from the trees and understand things more holistically is definitely a huge value of visualization. Visualization is very helpful in communicating and providing the option for people to derive meaning from complex information, complex data, etc. I'd be curious to take the poll and see who sees in the image a young girl or an old woman. And there's definitely chances for things to be interpreted multiple ways, but the way we craft visualizations has a lot to do with the meaning that comes out of data and information. We believe that no visualization is truly useful unless it is targeting the truth, and the pursuit of truth is obviously a relentless endeavor, but we're always trying to be mindful of this graph and work toward the, as close as we can to the analysis piece. We've got stories all over the world of information and misinformation. Social media has become, a total playground for truth that is very difficult to understand. And so we think there's a great responsibility in the active visualization and of visual communication to ensure that we are trying to remain true to what the data really is trying to tell us. So you put all this together, all of these four kind of guiding principles, and we get to a state that we actually call beauty. And for us, it's a very beautiful thing. It's very multifaceted when we can bring information together, visualize it, communicate it in a way that is finally getting to providing that wisdom that we talked about earlier in the pyramid. That's where things have value. That's where people can take great action, and not just action, but tested action that we know is beneficial. Outcomes become more positive, and we could really start to see some results as people are working on very complex problems. And so that's this place of beauty. We believe that that's part of every active visualization is beauty. I argue I don't argue. In our work, we are very preoccupied with the four musts, I call them. So in every visualization that we create, it must be highly intuitive. If people, there's a culture of the way that people interact with information these days, whether it be Facebook or Uber or Lyft or any of the kind of very ubiquitous interactive platforms out in the world. And when people have a certain minimum threshold for how they expect to work with information, and what we found is that if visualization techniques are not intuitive up front, people very quickly turn off and unplug and do not engage with the information at hand. They will go elsewhere and find other sources of the information. Visualizations must be, in our minds, insightful. Being beautiful is not purely an aesthetic pursuit. If something's not insightful, it's not actionable. And so it's very important to us that the purpose of a great visualization is to provide insights that weren't otherwise available. Similarly to a visualization being intuitive, it must be inspiring. And again, this is about engagement and promoting engagement. If there are plenty of dashboards out in the world and visualization approaches and strategies that are potentially technically appropriate, and they may function just fine. But we found that things will be adopted, and they will be owned, and they will be maintained over time, and they will be promoted, and they will be put to much higher quality and higher value of use if they are inspiring. If there's a reason that people are driven to want to use these visualization platforms. And lastly, they must be intellectually honest. This gets back to the propensity for data to be misused, to be misinterpreted, et cetera. So we do a lot of work to try to ensure that, if we're uncertain about a value, that's being communicated, and make sure that these visualizations are open and accessible, but that they are not sort of used for the dark side, essentially. So with that, I would like to switch over and walk through a couple examples of work that builds on all of those principles and that experience. I will need about 30 seconds to a minute to switch my screen here, so it might be a good time to maybe take a break and just ask if anybody that has their audio on has any kind of quick questions before I jump into these examples.
I've unmuted the phone for everyone if anyone wants to ask questions right now.
Okay, I'm not hearing any questions, which is great. So I'm going to go ahead and jump on into a couple demos of some of the work. So if everyone can see my screen here, so this is a project called Landfall that we did a couple years ago, working with OCIA, which is a DHS branch. The challenge here was that OCIA does a lot of work in reporting out to cities and other groups relative kind of levels of risk around infrastructure, especially. Their reporting mechanisms are traditional and some of the kind of long text type things that I talked about earlier. And so the challenge here was to create basically an interactive digital narrative that allowed stakeholders to access the information in a more intuitive, more kind of inspiring way. So as a case study, we looked at Charleston, South Carolina, specifically looking at hurricane risk for that city. We were really interested up front. You know, we try to approach these projects as kind of neutral and childlike. We do a lot of asking questions, and then we seek data and information and analytics that we can put together to start to answer some of those questions. So the first question here was, well, how does Charleston, South Carolina, and its relationship to hurricanes start to compare to the rest of the country? So what we did is we gathered up NOAA's records of all the hurricanes since 1850, strung together those approximately 1,900 storms, and we're running these in simulated time here. So I'm actually actively dragging this time slider through time, and we're building essentially a heat map of all the traces and signatures of these 1,900 storms. So by the time we get to present day, where we're seeing on the histogram a greater number of storms potentially linked to climate change, you can see a great big hotspot off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and start to look at kind of what's at stake when an area like Charleston, what's in its path essentially. So this is a case where, in order to start to tell that story, we had to actually string together multiple different data sets around critical infrastructure. So this is looking at municipal, local sources, federal sources, public and private sources. And as far as we understand it, it could be potentially one of the most comprehensive data sets of critical infrastructure for the city of Charleston. And we just quickly, and again, this is about communication. This piece itself is not analytic. It's about communication. So if a stakeholder in Charleston is trying to understand what's at play here, what we've done is basically take account as someone runs that storm across the city. We've taken account of assets kind of in the line of fire. So 138 electric substations, 17 different rail stations, 37 wastewater treatment plants, et cetera. So this is a great way to start to show people in the city, you know, sort of what happens when a storm comes through. And we're not saying that all those things go down or that there's tremendous damage per se to those things, but those are the things that are affected or could be affected by the storm. The next thing we were interested in addition to infrastructure, was looking at the sort of social impacts and how that data and information can be brought to bear to help first responders and other folks help mitigate social issues in the event of a storm. So we're looking at a CDC social vulnerability index. And what's great about this is we can look at across a number of different categories relative to the storm. So the larger the circle here, the greater the population density, and the brighter the color, the more vulnerable across these different categories. So we're looking at socioeconomic status. So someone that is very affluent, probably has means to evacuate or protect and hunker down better than someone who is not affluent. Household composition, a household with 8 to 12 people is much more difficult to evacuate than a smaller household. Minority status and language, trying to communicate to Charleston and first responders, emergency management department that they need to be very cognizant of which languages evacuation instructions are published in and status updates. And housing and transportation, looking at a group of people specifically here on the Charleston Peninsula downtown area whose housing may be in substandard condition and may be excessively vulnerable to weather a storm. And with low access to private transportation, these folks may have a more difficult time evacuating. So the next story there was, well, so what does that peninsula look like when a storm comes its way? And so this is combining two different data sets. It's a LIDAR data set from the National Geospatial Agency and NOAA's SLOSH model. We're also looking at and very interested in AdCIRC flood modeling as well. I'm letting this big data set in the background load here. But what we wanted to do is try to give people a very kind of quick and intuitive and easy way to start to understand what's going to happen in the event of a flood. A lot of folks are maybe not familiar with FEMA flood maps or don't have great access to them, or in some cases the FEMA flood maps are outdated or not high resolution, et cetera. So we were trying to put this information in the hands of people that could make kind of quick assessments. So what we've done is combine these two data sets at a very kind of high level of urban accuracy. And we've highlighted critical lifeline assets in pink, so the port, police station, substation, et cetera. We can start to query these and see what things are. In yellow is major economic assets. So the college, major employers. Down here is the medical university and the hospital. And what we can do is, if we know that the forecast for an impending storm is, say, 7 feet maybe of inundation, I can slide the slider up on the right, and every time buildings basically get hit by that inundation in the simulation, they start to light up. So it becomes a very quick call to action for planning folks and preparation folks to make sure that, in this case of the hospital at the medical university, that the generators are shored up and up the first floor if possible, and that the first floor is kind of evacuated, et cetera, to deal with that level of inundation. So a second project I'll show you, TSA, their operations in airports is a very complex problem. There's a lot of modeling that they've done around their relative level of effectiveness. The way it works is that they rely on a layered security posturing, and so each layer is designed to achieve a certain percentage of target identification or threat identification. And so everything from behavior detection officers out on the street curb when you pull up, all the way to the folks that check your documents and the baggage screeners, et cetera. And TSA's got really great data on each of those nodes, but a lot of the data is very discrete and it deals only with that specific node. And so we put together this platform, which the theory here was to use a advanced visualization technique to allow TSA to understand many different nodes as a system, a more comprehensive look at it, to try to let them see how a different threat might propagate through the system. So what you're looking at is a mock-up of JFK International Airport. The data here is all notional, so none of these values are true or realistic values. This is purely kind of a proof of concept type project. What I can do is obviously I can fly around the airport, but if I'm a TSA decision maker and I'm trying to understand what the week might look like, I can look at my threat report that I might get from my TSA colleagues and other intelligence sources, and I can select one of those threat profiles up here on the top. So in this case, we're looking at the way a threat would move through the airport, specifically relevant to an assembled non-metallic carry-on IED. And what you're seeing here is basically a running simulation of movements to a certain time schedule. And you're seeing everything in magenta essentially is an unknown or could be a threat. everything that has turned blue statistically is probable that the security posturing has resolved that entity as a non-threat at that point. So what we want, if the system is working properly and keeping everybody 100% safe, then we're seeing a lot of things turning blue as the entities propagate. So when they first arrive into the system, we're essentially they're unknown, so we have to treat everything as a threat until proven otherwise, essentially. So we've modeled out essentially all of those discrete nodes within that security posturing system and an effectiveness rating that we're stringing up together. So you can see this might be a case where you might have several folks that are on this line of security that are on the 11th hour of a 12-hour shift, and their effectiveness as a group is sort of somewhat down. And so you might have other areas where you've got a bunch of fresh folks that are performing very well. And so a security manager might look at this and want to sort of balance out the load a little bit in those lines. Similarly, we could look at different terminals, and we could see, like, this terminal, for example, seems to be operating very well with regard to detecting this type of a threat profile. So this could be a case where TSA might want to look at this terminal specifically, try to understand how that terminal is postured relative to this threat, and then take some of those conditions and reapply them out to other terminals that aren't doing so well. Similarly, this is a great kind of resource allocation tool, trying to get a sense on does TSA need more staff in this terminal to be able to handle this type of threat, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've set this up to be a prototype that was scheduled for kind of deployment and testing in several different airports. I think there's a ton of potential as a next phase for this to start to become basically kind of have simulation capabilities as opposed to, kind of wargaming scenario. So if what's the result and how does that impact my sort of overall threat? The next one here is a project we did for a nonprofit called the Trust for Public Land. So TPL. TPL is a national organization. They've been around since the 70s. As I said, they're a nonprofit. They develop new parks and they redevelop old parks to bring out greater value, specifically with the intent of trying to serve underprivileged and vulnerable communities with meaningful public space. And so in their work, part of what they're trying to accomplish is they're trying to develop parks such that every person living in an urban area in the United States has a meaningful piece of public space within a 10-minute walk from their home. And so one of the things they struggle with all the thousands of development projects that they've done over the years is really being able to kind of document the impact of these projects, trying to understand after a park was built, how did that change the landscape of the community, trying to understand who's actually visiting these parks and when, and what's their sort of demographic and cultural profile, to try to understand the way that these parks are impacting folks. And so historically that's been done with a traditional kind of paper and pencil clipboard type survey. We were tasked with trying to look at kind of big data sources and analytics as a way to help them get some better intelligence about who's using their park. So again, this is kind of in prototype proof of concept state. But we looked to anonymized cell phone location data. So this animation here is the home location of people that visited this specific study park within a 2-week or a 2-month period. And we're able to, through the movements of cell phones, understand where those people basically call home, where they lay their head at night. We can't understand that down to a building scale, due to privacy issues. We wouldn't want to, but it's very useful for us to get a sense of the sort of broader neighborhood areas where people live that had visited this park. So in this case, what you're seeing is this dashed line here is the Trust for Public Lands network graph of what they call a 10-minute simulated walk around the boundaries of this park. The colors here represent basically the number of people who live in these neighborhoods who visited the park during this 2-month study period. So you can see that number varies. So there's even areas down here in white where we really didn't see any visitation during that 2-month study period. And it's a short period of time, and it's an interesting sample set. So I'd be really curious to see what this looks like over maybe a year spectrum, looking at the same park and try to compare and contrast and see if we see differences. But as a proof of concept, what we've done is link these values for these different neighborhoods in terms of visitation over to EPA's got an index that they call EJ screen that's specifically looking at understanding vulnerable populations, which is, again, a big part of the TPL's mission. And in this case, this area that had quite a few visits on the right has a significant number of children under 4, whereas an adjacent neighborhood which had half as many visitors during this period of time, very many fewer kids under the age of 4. And so what this is allowing TPL to do is start to get a little bit better look at where people are living that are visiting these parks and what types of kind of vulnerability issues they may be up against. And so it's really interesting to see. TPL's theory was that visitation would essentially radiate outward from the park, a series of kind of radiating circles with less visitation the farther you got. But what's really interesting is the way that this stuff is pocketed. And so it clearly means that there are folks that have some reason, some incentive to visit from farther away than this 10-minute walking circle. So it's actually really prompting TPL to sort of rethink in many ways the way that they're crafting that part of their mission. So the second piece of this was looking not at where people live, but looking at more specifically how do they move through the city and which parts of the park are those people making use of when they visit. So every green dot you're seeing here is essentially a location ping. There's I believe several thousand of these per day per device. It's something like, I guess maybe not thousand, maybe on the order of hundreds. It's something like every 5 minutes roughly, cell phones ping towers and we get a location point out of that. So this is 1 month study period. You're seeing the movements throughout the city of any device that was documented within the park boundary at any time during that month. So what TPL is really interested in here is the parks here in the middle, sort of hidden in some of this green here, but what they're really interested in is some of these other hotspots, right? Where are these other areas of the city that people who visited the park are also frequenting? Are these employment areas? Are they entertainment districts? Why are they moving to these sort of common areas in the city? But more importantly, if we zoom in here, we can start to see some patterns. So again, this is only 1 month of data, and so it'd be really interesting to look at this over the course of a year or two and be able to draw much deeper inferences here. But you can already start to see, the soccer field has some activity on both sides here, which makes a lot of sense. There's some folks watching baseball and softball games. It's a little harder to see, but the basketball court here looks to be very underutilized, as does this pocket of kind of generic open space up here to the north. Again, hard to see, but this piece of the playground is getting better used than this other piece of the playground. And so what this allows the Trust for Public Land to do is be able to put down some analytics and say, it looks like we've got quite a bit more people using the soccer field than we do this generic space. And so if we were going to rethink a little bit of this park, what would we do with this open space up here? And so the idea here would be to build a more comprehensive library of these studies across hundreds or thousands of Trust for Public Land parks around the country, and start to think about, given a certain neighborhood and a certain demographic pattern, and a given amount of space, what could this be, and what historically has been sort of most effective? We can also do a lot of other kind of just very quick things with this data, like allow for the Trust for Public Land to see variations across different days of the week, just with quick filtering. Very useful for people actually operating parks to think about when do they mow the lawn, when do they pick up the trash, et cetera. But also very useful for people scheduling events to say, if I'm going to do a yoga event, should I do it in the midday or should I do it in the afternoon? So I'm going to show one more, and then I'd like to, I guess at that point, open up for questions and comment. So this is a project we are working on, looking at what's called the social determinants of health. If anyone's not familiar, it's basically the study of the way that social, behavioral, and environmental factors I'm not sure who's making Does anybody else hear that?
Yes, Brian, I'll try and mute everyone. Brian,
Yes.
when I muted you, that seemed to work.
Oh, that's interesting.
It stopped now.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I have no idea what that was.
I'll mute myself now.
Okay. So hopefully everyone can hear me again now. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. So this is a project that we did working on visualization and analytics to try to work on what's called social determinants of health. So historically, the healthcare industry and doctors are trained, and they're very specialized in dealing with kind of the clinical biological conditions of healthcare. And so that the old model was treating the symptoms, and then you know, modern medicine has been very interested in trying to treat root causes and understand things kind of predictively in terms of people's clinical risk for developing chronic conditions. What certain people are starting to see is this sort of upside down pattern in which something like 85 to 90% of the costs of delivering healthcare occur after a patient has been diagnosed with a chronic high cost type condition. But 85% or to 90% of the factors which actually contribute to that person and their likelihood of developing these chronic conditions is happening outside of the healthcare system before that diagnosis takes place. And so this is an effort to start to leverage data science and visualization as a way to give doctors and community health leaders tools to help understand some of those contributing root cause factors in a geographic way. So two of the issues here, there's a lot of great data that's available that's published by a number of really great federal sources that is published at like county level, county scale. And the problem that is actually that's actually happening here is that a lot of there can be huge variations in things like life expectancy that in certain areas of the world, one neighborhood adjoining another neighborhood, the life expectancy difference can be a decade. And so the scale from neighborhood to neighborhood, or even in some cases block to block, is super important for folks to be aware of. And those types of environmental or socioeconomic kind of variances at that tiny fine-grained scale are super important. And so it's problematic that a lot of the best data available for this stuff is often published at a very large scale. And so we've done a lot of data science work to help bring the scale down of this stuff and look at it at a neighborhood to neighborhood basis. And then secondly, the folks who really need this information are not GIS technical experts. And so for someone familiar with working with that type of data, it's completely elementary to combine multiple data sources to create sort of synthetic values, to understand the role of multiple different indicators or sort of risk values relative to trying to understand some of these social determinants of health. But the folks in the healthcare industry typically are not GIS experts. They don't have access to great analysts on a daily basis. These are folks like doctors and clinicians and case management specialists. So what we've done here is string this up in a way that allows those folks to have a much more sort of intuitive access to those multiple different types of information. So as an example here, if I'm interested in something like issues of kind of diabetes, I know as a clinician or a doctor or a case manager that access to healthy food is a big part of a person's propensity to develop diabetes down the road. So in this case, I can click on the food deserts layer, and the map you're seeing here is basically the scale is everything in pinks and magentas is considered kind of a high value, in this case, high risk of being a food desert. And things that trend more toward the light blues and whites are considered kind of lower values. So in this case, lower risk for food desert. So you can see that there's a number of different areas in this part of San Antonio that we're looking at that could be considered food deserts. And it's information that's useful, but it's maybe more interesting if we were to look at putting a couple things together. So let's say we're interested in not just food deserts, but food deserts where income is particularly low. And so, now we're getting at a place where both access and affordability of food might be an issue. And you can see that the number of kind of pink hotspots around the city starts to decrease, and we're starting to hone in on some more specific parts of the city. Furthermore, if I was really, if I know based on my literature and my research that food insecurity has more long-term lasting impacts for school-age kids than it does for adults, I could pull that layer in about age, and now we're even further being able to kind of zoom into these very specific areas of action. And so, if I was a director of a food bank or someone planning an intervention or any kind of activity to try to target food insecurity around these issues, I would now have kind of two very clear areas of the city that I would want to at least consider targeting for those interventions. And so this is really set up to help guide those types of decisions and provide information in a very kind of intuitive, very quick access way to help inform some of those decisions. So once I've got a heat map built, I can essentially get some additional information on some of these different neighborhoods and try to get a sense of how the values differ from maybe a good, healthy neighborhood to a more at-risk neighborhood. I can start to click down through these, and I can see these are the two zip codes within the city for this value of school-age kids, and the histogram here is basically all the other zip codes in the city. So in this case, we're looking at two neighborhoods that have, on average, quite a few more or a higher percentage of school-age kids. This one doesn't change a whole lot over time. Age tends to stay roughly kind of the same over time, but we've also started to pull some historic data into this as well to start to see trends across a lot of these indicators. So with that, I think everyone, thank you for your time. And again, it's a privilege to be here and to share this type of work, the stuff that's passionate, that I'm passionate about. I would love to kind of open it up. I'm happy to answer maybe a few minutes of any kind of specific questions anyone has. And if there aren't any questions, then thanks everyone very much. It's been a pleasure.
I've opened up the mic for everyone if they would like to ask questions.
So here's a question from Heather. What tools do you use to build the visualization? So what we've done in our organization is we have built out a number of different functional divisions. So one of those is, two of those are a design group and a cognitive psychology group, and the second one is a web development group. We found it, as we got into the space, we found it really beneficial to build these as web-based platforms because we found that they don't require a license. They can be easily shared, but they can also be easily password protected and access controlled in other ways. But what was great about that is that if someone found a great insight, they could quickly share with colleagues. They can access it from anywhere in the world without having to download a piece of software. The power of modern browsers has really kind of opened up hugely new doors. So we are technology agnostic at this point. We essentially are looking at open source stacks and all kinds of different development workflows that basically are kind of custom designed. The architecture of each of these is custom designed to meet the performance and the informational and the use case needs of that endeavor. And so we use all kinds of different libraries: D3, JavaScript, Python, a whole kind of suite of anything that's out there. We're constantly hunting for new stuff too. So I always love when people have interesting recommendations for our development folks, especially about, hey, did you hear about this new capability that JavaScript just unrolled, or have you heard about the new Python coming out, or whatever. It's all good stuff. So I hope that answers the question. Any others?
If there aren't any other questions, I just want to say thank you, Brian, so much for a really interesting talk. We do have other webinars coming up soon. The next one is Monday, July 30th at 3 p.m. Central Time, and it's Dr. Vivek Tandon from the University of Texas, El Paso, and we'll be sending out more information about that shortly. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.